Hello everyone, welcome to your online how to do lecture on using the PEDro scale to critically assess and appraise randomized control trials in the literature. This particular critical appraisal scale or checklist is only used to appraise randomized control trials. So if you are a student who has identified research articles to use in your critical appraisal topic that are not randomized control trials, then you certainly do not want to use this particular checklist. But since this is the checklist that's most often used, because we most often use randomized control trials in our critical appraisal topics, we're going to spend time showing you how we work through this, how we find data to help us answer the 11 criteria. But if you're using, let's say, a cohort study or a retrospective study, for example, you might be better off using other appraisal checklists within the module, such as the STROBE, for example, which is most often used for cohort observational studies. Today's focus, however, is on the PEDro scale. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, this is the PEDro scale and all 11 of the criteria that are used to kind of score or grade your randomized control trial. And interestingly enough, even though there are 11 criteria, the PEDro scale is only scored out of 10. And so let me walk you through that, because most often it's very counterintuitive for students. They see 11 criteria, so the score should be 11 out of 11. But in all actuality, number one is not truly included in the total or sum score once you're evaluating a research article, and here's why. Number one is about the eligibility criteria being specified, or another way to say that, do the research authors in this particular article actually specify their inclusion and exclusion criteria. And so what we know about research articles that do not specify their inclusion exclusion criteria is that it increases the risk for researcher bias, number one, and it doesn't give us the ability to make the results generalizable to a specific set or a population of patients. And so if a research article does not state inclusion or exclusion criteria, it just needs to be one, then we would check no on this box. And interestingly enough, we would throw that research article out and we wouldn't continue to score 2 through 11. So this is why the PEDro scale is out of 10, is because this first one really just allows us to know if the research article can actually be generalizable to the population. And if they can't give us inclusion exclusion criteria, then our concern is that there's researcher bias inherent, and it isn't something that we would want to apply to clinical practice. On the opposite end of that, if they do check yes, right, then we move forward and we score all 2 through 11. So it isn't that if we select no on number 2, we don't score number 3. The only one that we stop on would be number 1. If the answer is no, we throw that research article out and then we attempt to find another solution. So in this research article, does ankle tape improve proprioception acuity immediately after application and following a netball session, which is a randomized control trial? What I typically do is search through to figure out where the eligibility criteria was specified. And most often that's going to be in the methods section of the research article. In this particular case, the exclusion criteria was specified, and it's right here. Athletes were excluded if they had a current injury preventing them from participating in netball. In addition to that, an inclusion criteria was that they had to be female. All athletes were female, and they had a mean age of about 17.7. So we can see here, even though it's not explicitly listed, we know that there's an exclusion that's happening. We know that they're included if they're female. And so we can check yes on this. We can write page 21 in this where area, and then we can move to number 2. Number 2 says subjects were randomly allocated into groups. In other words, there was randomization of patients into the different groups that the study had. So patient A might be randomized into said treatment group, patient B might be in the placebo group. So there are different ways to find that. Again, most often it's going to be in the methods section. So right here, following the proprioception assessment, athletes were randomly allocated to either a self-applied or SEP applied tape group, right? And so the answer to question 2 is yes, they were randomly allocated into groups. either self-applied or SEP group, right? So the answer is yes. For number 3, was allocation concealed? And the answer would be yes to that. In other words, does the person who decided the exclusion inclusion criteria not know which groups they're going into? And the answer is yes. And it's hard to see it here, but it's right here. Self-applied tape group using a computer-generated randomization. So that's how we know that the allocation was concealed in this particular study. In addition to that, another way that we see that is the lead author generated the randomized allocation sequence and enrolled athletes and assigned athletes to the taping condition. So again, another way that that was concealed from the other researchers in the actual study. Now, so that would be a yes, and that would be page 21. For number 4, the groups were similar at baseline regarding the most important prognostic indicators. So what this means is we want to make sure that after we're done randomly allocating each group, we want to make sure that they're at least equal at baseline, right? Because if we have one group that's higher than another, then we might not see changes. So one way that I do this is literally by scrolling down to one of the research tables and kind of looking at just numbers, eyeballing numbers, right? So we can see at baseline, right, the groups were relatively equal at baseline in terms of the values or the numbers before they started the actual treatments, right? So that would be a yes, and that would be on page 23. Now, the next 3 questions, 5, 6, and 7, all have to do with blinding. And again, that's going to go back into the methods section. So in the methods section, what we want to do is figure out, was the person who was collecting data blinded? Was the person doing the rehab or the taper blinded? And then were the subjects blinded to whether or not they got the treatment, if that makes sense. So right in this area, it kind of tells us that the testers were blinded to the taping condition. So the people who were assessing number 7 were blinded. So that would be a yes. Was there blinding of all therapists or tapers? The answer would be no, because you know that which tape job you are using for that particular patient. And then were the subjects blinded? In this particular study, it does not state that. So subjects probably knew which tape job they were getting. So that would be a no. 6 would be a no, but 7 would be a yes. The assessors, the people taking the outcomes, were blinded. And to me, that's probably the most important of the 3, 5, 6, and 7, is that the person taking the outcome measure was blinded, so they wouldn't be biased, right, towards one treatment or another. Next, number 8, measures of at least one key outcome were obtained from more than 85% of the subjects initially. In this particular study, I chose to use their concert flowchart. So what that means is we're looking at, we had 53 patients who were assessed for eligibility based on inclusion-exclusion criteria. We had 53 subjects actually get randomized into the 2 groups. And so as we follow this down, we can see 27, 27, 27, 27, which means we didn't lose anyone, no one dropped out. And then in the other group, we had 26, 26, 26, 26. So again, we didn't lose anyone and they didn't drop out. So yes, in this particular case, measures of at least one outcome were obtained for at least 85%, in this case, 100% of the subjects, right? Number 9, all subjects from whom outcome measures were available received the treatment or condition as allocated. And so again, this is a yes, right? Because we know that 27 athletes started in this self-applied taping first, 27 athletes were assessed, 27 athletes did the sports physiotherapist taping, and 27 athletes were assessed. So again, usually if the answer to number 8 is yes, most often the answer to number 9 is also going to be yes, and the where obviously would be on page 22. And then the last 2 really have to do with statistics and outcome measure reporting. So for number 10, the results of between group statistical comparisons are reported for at least one outcome measure. Most often I go to the table, the research table. And so what we're looking at with number 10 is, did they report pre-post data and at least for one outcome? And the answer would be yes. These are AMITA scores, and these are the scores pre, and these are the scores post tape post-netball and post-netball again with no tape. So we can see that, yes, we have data being reported between the groups. And then last but not least would be the study provides point measures and measures of variability for at least one outcome. So by this, point measures typically mean what is the mean, and then measures of variability is most often the standard deviation. So here we can see we have a mean and we have a standard deviation. Similarly, we have a mean and we have a standard deviation. So that would be yes. So if we were to review the score for this particular study, we would say the answer was yes for number 1, right? The answer was yes for number 2. The answer was yes for number 3. The answer was yes for number 4. The subjects were not blinded, so that was a no. The person taping the patients was not blinded, so that was a no. The person taking the outcome measures was absolutely a yes. And then we had a yes for outcome measures being reported for at least 85%. We had a yes that there were no dropouts. And then we had a yes for between group statistical comparisons. And we had a yes that, in fact, the study provided point measures of variability. And so if we add this up, remember, we exclude number 1, we add the number of yeses, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points out of 10. It would not be 9 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 out of 11. It would not be that. We would start counting or adding at point 2, move down to 11. So again, in this case, we have 8 out of 10, which is a relatively high PEDro score. I really do hope this has been helpful and that you can see the ways in which the PEDro scale, or really any of our critical appraisal checklists, really help us determine, not just based on the significance of a study, but also help us determine how valid the study is based on the things that the researchers did within their research